£32, followed by 46 monthly rentals. Annual mileage 10,000. You will not own the car. Participating Citroën dealers.
It's 9 o'clock across the UK.
I'm just wondering why the coalition is discriminating against mothers like me.
No, absolutely not.
The biggest hour of talk radio is here.
Politically, to sort of be somehow accused of being soft on knife crime. I'm not soft on knife crime at all.
The Deputy Prime Minister is here, and he wants to speak directly to you. Call Clegg.
You say you're ashamed. I'm actually immensely proud.
I am a Liberal Democrat who's just torn up his membership card.
Call 0345 6060 973. There's no other place you can talk directly to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Nick Clegg.
Get straight through to Nick Clegg on LBC now. You won't hear this anywhere else. And that's why we're LBC, leading Britain's conversation.
It's 9 o'clock on Thursday, the 19th of June. So let's get started. Do call on 0345 6060 973 or email at nickclegg@lbc.co.uk. And of course, you can watch as ever on the website lbc.co.uk. So let's go straight to the first caller, Zach. Zach in Greenwich. Hello, Zach.
You're right, Nick. How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm okay. My question is, considering that the narrative coming from these jihadis that they want a puritanical Islamic state and they want to live by the laws of the Sharia and whatnot, however warped they may be or whatever you may, like the West may think of that, do you really believe David Cameron, when in his narrative, when he says that they pose the biggest threat to the UK on UK soil?
I'm afraid, and yesterday we met in the National Security Council for the umpteenth time to look at that. And that's the sort of group that gets together in Whitehall to look at this. Prime Minister's the chairman of that. I'm the vice chair, and I'm afraid it appears to be a fact that the flow of people leaving the UK, going to Syria, for instance, becoming ever more radicalised and extreme in their views, but also, of course, becoming ever more expert in the use of violence, and then wanting to come back to inflict that violence on our streets is now one of the biggest security challenges we face, and that's why we've been pretty open as a government, saying, look, this is a big issue. It's right up there at the top of the security agenda of the things that we're looking at government, and we're doing everything we can to either discourage people from going there in the first place, or, of course, making sure we keep an eye on them if they come back with violent intentions. It's one of the, I'm afraid, it's one of the oldest things that violence begets violence, and that appears to be the case, and that's why this bloody, barbaric, brutal civil war in Syria is not only so tragic for the Syrian people, it's dangerous for the rest of us as well.
Zach, go ahead.
It seems like to me that it's a similar narrative to what Tony Blair said about Iraq when he invaded Iraq. Sorry, can I just...
Yeah, sure.
Here's my point. Tony Blair, he said last week about it wasn't it's the lack of intervention in Syria that has caused this to happen. However, the way I see it is that if the UK was to intervene in Syria, and it's a good thing that they didn't intervene in Syria, who would they be fighting? Would they be fighing the Assad regime, or would they be fighting ISIS? It makes no sense what he said, and I just think the man's delusional.
Well, I mean, what you think about Blair, or indeed what I think about Blair, is slightly different to your first question. Blair, as you know, Blair and Bush claimed at the time that we needed to invade Iraq in order to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction. It was a completely different claim he made at the time, one which, by the way, unlike Conservative and the Labour parties, my party opposed. We said very clearly, no, that is not a good enough reason. You haven't proved your case. I also happen to remain personally of the view that it was not a legally sound decision either. You're asking me a slightly different question, which is having people go from our country to a war zone, becoming ever more angry and extreme in their views and ever more practiced at using violence. Is that a threat to us? Yes, self-evidently it is. Do I think the solution for that is that we should invade Iraq? No, of course not. We're not going to invade Iraq. We're not going to take military action ourselves as a country in Iraq. But that's not to say it is not a threat. It's not to say that we shouldn't work with other countries in order to deal with that through counter-terrorism measures, through intelligence, obviously working with the Iraqi government where we can in order to make sure that there is a semblance of stability in that country. But so I actually agree with you that kind of just going around invading every country where you think there's a problem is not necessarily the solution. Though I have to say, I think on Syria there was a case to deal with the weapons of mass chemical weapons, which was the debate at the time. But I think we can't put our head in the sand. This is a real problem.
Deputy Prime Minister, what are we to take from Tony Blair popping up over the last few days and saying that, in fact, it was justified and that it was right he did what he did in Iraq, and it's important that we took the action we did?
Well, my view, listening to him, is that there's one thing where I actually think he's got a point, which is what Zach and I just discussed, which is that the violence in Syria is acting as a sort of generator for violence elsewhere, and it has a spillover effect to other. We shouldn't pretend that kind of bloody civil war just is sort of hermetically sealed within the borders of Syria. I mean, I think he's self-evidently right. Where I think he's just plain wrong is to somehow suggest, which he sought to, which I thought was a rather contorted argument, that says what is happening in Iraq now would have happened even if we haven't invaded Iraq, and as if somehow the invasion of Iraq, which I thought was the most disastrous foreign policy decision that this country's ever participated in since the Suez crisis, is somehow disconnected with what happens 11 years later.
So the Arab Spring would not have sprung in Baghdad?
I personally am not going to spend a huge amount of time trying to reinvent history and say if this hadn't happened, would that have happened? Okay. And I think it's a slightly pointless thing for Tony Blair to have done. But on Syria, I think he and most people, and in a sense it's stating, I believe, the obvious, which is that kind of bloody civil war, going on with such ferocity over such a prolonged period of time. Of course it has an effect on people who move in and out of Syria, but also on neighbouring countries.
The Prime Minister, lastly on this before we move on to the next call, the Prime Minister, there's approximately 400 British-born or national
that we know of.
Can we not strip them of their citizenship? Do we have to let them back in, Mr. Clegg?
There are a number of things we can do and that we do, and Theresa May and the Home Office do seek to block people from travelling or block people from returning. So there are a number of things we're doing. We're also...
But can Britain actually take your citizenship away?
There are measures that we can take. We're also strengthening the measures we can take by making it an offence to participate in the planning of any terrorist activities elsewhere outside the United Kingdom. So we're going to change the law. We're going to do that in the coming weeks and months to sort of fill what we think is a gap in the law there. So there are a lot of things we can do, but we live in a free society. People do move around. We don't have the thought police. You can't check what every person's intention is. This is a fluid situation, and I think it's right that we say, without causing undue alarm, that we're nonetheless fairly straight with people that this is a serious issue which we're treating very seriously. Yes. And no one should be under illusions about what is at stake.
And so some people you could foresee a situation in which a leading terrorist would actually have his British citizenship taken away.
As I say, we can take people's passports away if we think that their intention is to...
And you could see that?
Well, it happens already. So there are measures that can already take... The Home Office already does those things within the powers that we've got. As I say, the one area where we think there is a case for additional legislative powers, we're moving to take on those new powers.
Let's get other callers involved.
David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good morning, Nick.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Clegg. My question regards China. Why is your government punishing Russia for annexing Ukraine, but rewarding China for doing the same to Tibet? And I say this because in 1959, the Dalai Lama, with over 100,000 Buddhist supporters, was forced into exile. And under Chinese occupation, there's been the systematic destruction of Tibet's culture and religion. Over 6,000 monasteries have been closed. There's been widespread detention without trial, torture, killings, and other abuse of human rights, similar to China itself. And millions of Chinese have been forcibly resettled in Tibet. So 6 million Tibetans are now a minority in their own country and treated as second-class citizens.
David, look, ever since I read as a young boy that book by is it Heinrich Harrer, the 7 Years in Tibet?
Yeah.
I've been, like many people, acutely aware of the unique religious and cultural identity of Tibet. I've met the Dalai Lama on a few occasions in his capacity as a religious leader, but as you know, we recognise that Tibet is part of China. But notwithstanding that recognition, of course, we believe, I passionately believe, that we should be firm, polite, but nonetheless forthright when we speak to the Chinese government in saying, look, the human rights abuses that are occurring in Tibet or indeed in other parts of China are simply not compatible with the status that China is seeking on the international stage. It doesn't mean we can't trade with China. In my own view, in the long run, more trade with China actually will bring in its wake political and social reform as well. But you're quite right in saying that, yes, Tibet is recognised by Great Britain as part of China, but that does not mean we should shirk from saying, look, whether it's in Tibet or indeed in any other part of China or in any other part of the world, if you believe that human rights are indivisible and universal, then you've got to have the courage to be able to say so, even when it is uncomfortable or inconvenient to do so. And that is what I do. That is what we do as a government. We seek to strike the right balance, do it, as I say, in a respectful but firm way. And that includes the human rights abuses that appear to be continuing in Tibet.
Quick response from you, David.
I'm not satisfied at all with that answer because my question was, Russia invades and annexes Crimea, and you punish them. China invades and annexes Tibet.
I know you're going to disagree, David. But David, so the difference is, I know you don't like it, but it's just a fact. The difference is Britain has long recognised Tibet as part of China. We don't recognise Crimea as part of Russia. It's just a difference. I know you don't like it, but that is, and by the way, that is not a distinction drawn by this government. That has been established some time ago. I know that's not going to satisfy you, but that is the way that Great Britain has responded over many years. All I'm saying to you is that doesn't mean, notwithstanding those differences, that we can't be firm and forthright about the human rights abuses that still continue on a significant scale in parts of China.
Deputy Prime Minister, did you meet with Premier Li?
No.
You did not? No, because you said that his regime is the antithesis of an open democratic society. So should he have been fated in the way? Because he actually met with the Queen. He's not the head of state, of course.
Look, as I've just said in response to David, it's a difficult balance to strike. China is a massive economic superpower. The economic transformation in China is something which is extraordinary. I mean, and by the way, it's a good thing for the millions, and it is millions and millions and millions of Chinese people who are now living in better economic circumstances than anyone dreamed possible even a few years ago. The level of economic transformation in China is extraordinary. But that doesn't, and that means that we should trade with China, develop commercial links.
Should we fate him in the way we did?
Well, I think one can have. I think you can be hospitable to someone who leads obviously such a significant country, but also be clear that in terms of our values, they're different.
Right.
They're different.
So if I came round your house, you'd put the flags out then, but you would let me know.
Nick, if you came round to my house, we'd have red carpets, we would have trumpets sounding,
right,
there would be
alarum.
Clarions from the rooftops in Putney celebrating your arrival.
I look forward to that. We move on. We move on to other calls.
A royal visit would be nothing compared to the welcome that the residents of Putney. Anyway, should we move on? Right, Matt in Chelmsford.
Yeah,
Matt.
Yeah.
Hello, Matt.
Good morning, guys. How you doing?
Hello, Matt. Yeah, fine.
Good, thank you.
Good. Nick, there's been a really lively discussion this morning on LBC about poverty and the definition of. I'd like to know what your definition of poverty is, and beyond that, do you feel that the austerity measures that have been made in the UK have been balanced across, the working class, middle class, and upper class?
And let me just, don't go, I just want to fill the Deputy Prime Minister. He might not have had sight of the Daily Mirror. This is research led by Bristol University. Your coalition government is under attack, Deputy Prime Minister. In 1983, 14% of Brits were living below the breadline. According to this research, it's now 33%. They say 18 million people can't afford adequate housing conditions. 5.5 million adults go without essential clothing. That's about 1 in 5. It has been challenged a lot, I should say, but that's the top line.
It has been challenged. I mean, Matt, look, firstly, as you know, you have this definition of relative poverty, the proportion of median income. The study, I haven't looked at it in detail, I will do, I think stretches back 30 years, so there are some big long-term trends that need to be identified there. The problem with this debate, Matt, as I think you anticipated, is that you can kind of slice and dice these things in different ways. So, for instance, inequality is actually lower under this government than it was under the previous government. Relative child poverty has actually gone down rather than gone up. But that is not to in any way deny that there are people, particularly since the crash in 2008, who have really been up against it, who've had a lengthy squeeze on their disposable incomes. That has, I think, made people understandably very angry because they feel they're having a real squeeze on their disposable incomes at a time when the people who they feel caused the crash in the banks and elsewhere aren't suffering elsewhere. You asked me, aren't sort of shouldering the burden of all of this. You asked me, what are we doing in this government? If you look at the facts rather than the allegations, the richest are paying more as a proportion of their income. In fact, by almost any measure, the richest are paying more than they did under any year under the previous government, because we have actually raised taxes. We've also, as you know, lifted the tax burden on people on low and middle incomes. That's something I've been very closely associated with, by raising the point at which you start paying income tax to £10,000 and beyond. That measure alone, for instance, Matt, will take just over 3 million people on low pay out of paying any income tax altogether for the first time. But yes, there have been some gory decisions on welfare reform. We have to reform the welfare system. Why? Partly because our economy's just got smaller, so we can't pretend that we can just carry on spending money as if nothing's happened. But secondly, we have to always work, in my view, to improve the incentives to work, because in the long run, getting people into work and then making sure that if they're on low pay, they don't pay excessively high levels of tax is one of the best ways of getting people out of poverty.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, Nick, I think you said a lot of things there I expect to see in the new manifesto. And I should point out that actually I voted for Lib Dem because of the many things that you've just kind of recited again there. I personally feel though, as I'm 27, I'm in a career which I'm happy with, but I'm earning over the national average wage, so I count myself as very lucky. But I do feel, and I have seen, particularly people I work with in the sector I work with.
Can I ask where you work, Matt?
I work in higher education, so I support university staff in teaching and learning.
Right.
But I have seen many people who have not seen wage increases or anything like that, over and around inflation, who are struggling, beyond what I would count is fair. Who feel very disenfranchised with the government because they do feel that they are being squeezed more and more, yet they're seeing people who are earning a lot more money who aren't feeling the pinch, and maybe that's just a communication issue. And going back to the question around poverty, I think that the fine line that has been drawn previously is now very clouded and very jaded, actually, because people are, they may not, as a previous caller pointed out, be classified as in a poverty-stricken environment because they have a mortgage, but they can't afford the basic things. And I think that's deeply shocking, and something that Lib Dems, or in particular the coalition, really do need to look at.
No, but Matt, look, you make a totally fair point, which is that as we repair and rescue and reform the shattered British economy from the kind of the state we found it in, you've got to try and do that as fairly as possible. I so happen to think, I mean, you've no doubt heard me say this before, I so happen to think that having Lib Dems in government means that we are doing this much more fairly than would happen if the Conservatives were doing this on their own. I'll give you another very specific example. One of the first things we did as a government, and I insisted on this, was I said we have to address the frankly grotesque situation under the previous government, that you could be a hedge fund manager in the City of London paying less on your shares than your cleaner was on their wages because of the difference between basically income tax and capital gains tax. So one of the first things we did was we raised capital gains tax by 10%. That was highly controversial, but with a lot of very wealthy people. But it was right, because we cannot have a tax system which was as lopsided as it was. And there are other things we've done, as you know, freezing, fuel duty, stopping the fuel price duties going up in the way that was planned by the previous administration, freezing council tax. These are all things which cost billions and billions and billions. So you have to find the money from elsewhere, which means you have to make difficult choices. But they're all aimed, whether it's tax, whether it's making the tax system fairer, whether it's council tax, whether it's fuel duty, all aimed at the point you make, which is that there are lots of people on modest incomes who have faced an unprecedented squeeze, who feel understandably, kind of angry. But it is, you're right, Matt, my job and others to explain, with all the kind of difficult and invidious choices we have to make, why we're making time and time again the choices which are done in their name in order to try and help them through this difficult time.
All right, can I feed in, thank you, Matt, can I feed in some email questions, Mr. Clegg? Rebecca in Newcastle, you were so opposed to the Snoopers Charter. Will you be having words with UK's Counter-terrorism's Charles Farr? He says it's OK to track my tweets and my Facebook update, says Rebecca.
Right. Well, Rebecca firstly makes a very important point about how you treat data, emails, communications, social, which is either beyond our shores or actually takes place within our shores. And one of the things I've come to the conclusion about a long time ago is that this distinction between what is domestic and what is external is increasingly becoming quite fluid by definition. You and I could send an email to each other, but it could be routed via a server in the other side of the planet, for instance.
Yes.
And that's why I've asked this independent think tank, RUSI, to do a review of all of that to make sure that we're keeping up with these technological developments and not resting on old-fashioned distinctions that no longer really make sense. But the only point I would make to Rebecca, which is incredibly important, there is no way in which any of the intelligence agencies can look at the content of any data stored, of any communication stored, which belongs to a British citizen here in Britain without a warrant. So what I think Charles Farr was referring to, what people have picked up on, is how data may or may not be stored. But it's really, really important that no one will be able to look at Rebecca's tweets or any of her communication, the content of them, what she's actually said, given that she clearly lives here and is a British citizen, without a warrant. And that's a very important distinction, which I think was somewhat lost in some of the coverage.
All right, thank you for that. Coverage of another story. This is my question of the day, if I may. A woman who was yesterday given an apology from MP Mike Hancock, one of your former MPs, in fact, I don't know if he's still with it, for inappropriate sexual advances, has criticised Nick Clegg for ignoring her claims for more than 4 years. Her name is Annie, it's not her real name. She's told one newspaper, The Guardian, the Lib Dem leader turned a blind eye after she called your office. I'll quote, Clegg has been negligent. He's put me through hell. I complained to Clegg's office in March 2011. It's taken 4 years to deal with Hancock. He's the MP who's apologised. There's supposed to be a system in place in the party to deal with MPs. They don't seem to use it. You're in the firing line, Mr. Clegg.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before. Unfortunately, and it is very, very unfortunately, and it frankly angered me when I discovered this, the letters that lady had sent back in 2011 simply didn't reach me. It simply didn't reach me. And I'm afraid I'm like any other person. I can only react to things that are put before me. And when in early 2013, specific allegations were brought to my attention because the court proceedings, were then underway, I acted very quickly, got it looked into, and within a matter of weeks, Mike Hancock was no longer an MP for the Liberal Democrats, and as you know, subsequently was suspended. His membership of the Liberal Democrats was suspended. But of course, the fact that somewhere, and this happens in all organisations, unfortunately, from time to time, something was sent to me which didn't reach me is, of course, something which she quite rightly feels frustrated about. But I hope she also knows, because I've sought to explain this on many occasions, when specific allegations were brought to my attention, the court proceedings were proceeded with early in 2013, I moved very quickly, and as I say, Mike Hancock shortly thereafter was no longer an MP for the Liberal Democrats.
But she claims she called your office as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid two things happened. Then there was a letter which went to the party headquarters, if you really must know the details, because the Hampshire Police and the CPS and others had looked into this and said we're not proceeding with it. The party, if you like, responded to that because they had no other information to go on. The moment I got something put in front of me which was specific, which was related to the court proceedings early in 2013, I acted immediately. But you're quite right, and she's quite right to say, back in 2011, something was sent to my office, it didn't reach me.
And a call was made.
Well, I can't.
Funny way to run a chip shop, isn't it?
Well, listen, I don't sit, I'm afraid, at a telephone bank, but I do accept that a letter was sent back in 2011 which did not reach me. That I do know.
You don't know about a call?
Well, I will look into the calls, but all I do know is that when I was given specific allegations early in 2013, I responded as promptly as I think anyone reasonably could expect I should, and Mike Hancock was subsequently suspended as an MP for the party.
And that's the final point in this. What is the future for Mr. Hancock?
He should resign from the party. Of course he should. Absolutely.
He's not coming back?
Oh, no. I mean, look, there are steps to go through, but look, he has made an apology which makes it absolutely clear that the way he behaved was totally and utterly out of order, as he himself has said, crossed the line with a vulnerable constituent. He's caused huge distress. Frankly, that has no role in the Liberal Democrats, the party I lead.
I've never met him. What's he like as a person?
Look, I'm not going to start talking about his character, but the fact that this apology has finally been made after all these years, I totally understand that the woman in question is saying, why on earth did this not happen earlier? But as far as his future is concerned, the party, he has no future in the party. He should resign.
Should we move on? We've got more calls, I think.
Yep. Kay in Wood Green. Kay?
Hi, good morning.
Hello.
Hi, this is a call regarding the longer days for school children.
Right.
Or working class. I was just wondering, it's a two-part question, basically. How is it going to work? Will the white working class children be segregated from their peers to carry this out? So what will happen to other low-achieving minorities who are also in the class?
Yes.
And the second part, I'd like you to explain how the statistics seem to show that young black boys are attaining higher educationally than white working-class boys, yet they remain the highest unemployed group in London, with over 50% unemployed.
Okay, just to explain to some listeners, this came out in some research earlier this week. The percentage of students getting A star through C grades is now among white working class boys and girls is the lowest. It's less than half, for instance, what Chinese girls attain. There was an initiative suggesting there should be extra hours put on the curriculum for all children, but specifically for white boys and girls, because they're the ones that are failing, and children would actually in some instances stay at school for the best part of about 10 or 11 hours. And the other point, Kay, you're driving at is that how come the black boys are doing much better in school, but then when it comes to employment, they're still falling behind what would appear to be poorly educated white boys who actually get the jobs.
Well, okay, I mean, you are putting under the spotlight probably the biggest failing in the school system in this country for many, many years, which is what they call in the jargon the attainment gap. So how is it that I remember reading some research which had made a huge impression on me some years ago, showing that bright but poor kids invariably, not always, but very often get overtaken in the classroom by a less bright but more affluent child by about the age of 7. Very early on. Very, very early on. The early years in primary school. And then after that, often the gap continues to widen. In other words, how you do in school is more closely associated with the income of your parents than your natural gifts.
So should you stay in school longer if you're poorer, financially poorer?
So what do you do about it? Now, what I think we've got to do about it, and that's exactly what we are doing about it, I first wrote about this 10, 11 years ago, and finally we're actually delivering this in government, is you've got to put more money, more resources behind the education of the children who deserve and need most of the help. And that's what we're doing through this thing, Kay, called the Pupil Premium. It's £2.5 billion of extra money which goes to those schools which are catering to the kids from the poorest backgrounds, and that allows the teachers, and here's the important practical point, okay, it allows the teachers then to decide how and when they give extra one-to-one tuition, maybe even Saturday morning catch-up classes. Some of that pupil premium money, for instance, is being used, I think, to very good effect to make sure that kids, as they make the leap from primary school to secondary school, have got some support in the summer holiday to do so, because time and time again we find that it's the kids from the poorest families who find that leap from the sort of small sheltered primary school to the bigger sort of slightly rougher atmosphere of secondary school hardest to take. So we're putting in the extra resources so the extra hours, the extra tuition, the extra support can be delivered, and I'll be fairly shortly awarding some prizes to the schools that have shown how best to use that extra money, that pupil premium money. It can have a brilliant effect at closing the attainment gap.
Including longer hours?
It can do. If what you think is right for a child is to spend a bit of extra time either before school or after school, or even maybe on a Saturday morning, particularly doing intensive work on numeracy and literacy and the other basic skills that you need to get a good education, often in small groups or one-to-one, that, then teachers should be allowed to do that. But Kay, we're not going to turn this around overnight, but I think we're finally starting to put into place the measures needed to make sure that the education does what it says on the tin. It releases the potential that is in every child, regardless of the circumstances of their birth.
And Kay, just to clarify, would never ever be white-only classes. It would be children who are not performing well, and it just so happens in a lot of they happen to be white. But if there were Chinese girls who weren't performing well, then they would be included. Just to nail that, Kay. Thank you very much indeed. Guess another email. Dan in Dartford. Nick Clegg, why are you still opposing Nick Dubois' idea to give mandatory jail terms to anyone who's carried a knife twice?
Sorry, who was it? Dan, was it?
Dan in Dartford.
Yeah, Dan. But look, I'm as intolerant and as tough as anybody else on knife crime, but I just want solutions that work. They don't just sound tough, catch headlines, but don't actually catch the kind of criminals and turn their life around.
Work about this seems to make sense to me. It does it on the tin or whatever that expression is.
Well, I don't think it does. What it will end up doing is you'll end up
go to jail.
No, hang on. Just let me be very clear. A young person, let's say, who's in a gang and is forced by a bigger, sort of more senior member of their gang to carry a penknife for them, right? Basically, if they're caught and charges are brought, then there is no discretion other than to chuck them. No, let me just to chuck them into prison for several months. The evidence is overwhelming. If you put young people into prison, regardless of any individual circumstances, any mitigating circumstances, into prison, guess what happens? You turn today's young offenders into tomorrow's hardened criminals. And I'm proud of the fact that we brought crime down to the lowest levels on record under this government. I'm proud of the fact we're starting to bring reoffending down. I'm proud of the fact that we've got lower numbers of young people in prison. I think this measure, it sounds tough. You will tell me you think it's great, Nick Ferrari. No, I don't think it'll work in practice.
How many?
You asked for an answer. Stop interrupting me.
Was one of your shorter ones. And how many children are appearing in courts in England, Wales and Scotland because they were carrying penknives?
I don't have the statistics on the top of my head.
Well, there are none, are they, Mr. Clegg?
No, wait a minute. There's a principle at stake. It says this measure, which has been supported by Labour...
You honestly think they would drag children into courts for carrying a penknife?
Look at what the law will now say if this measure is finally passed in Parliament. It says to judges, you have to imprison someone just for possessing a knife, having had a previous offence, regardless of any individual circumstances. And all I'm saying is, if you really want to be tough on knife crime, do what works. Don't just do the things that sort of catch headlines. Listen, I lived through the Blair years where we saw literally week after week after week, one tough-sounding measure after the next. I think there were 25 criminal justice measures. And actually, why I'm so disappointed with the Conservatives is that when we came together in the coalition, I remember vividly, we said, there's one thing we can really unite about is let's not resort to all these populist gimmicks on crime, which actually just lead to higher rates of repeat crime. And we've stuck to that. That's how we brought crime down. I think it's a pity that a few months before the general election, the Conservatives are once again resorting to the bad old Blairite habits of talking tough on crime rather than really doing what works.
Let's fit in one last question if we can, Deputy Prime Minister.
Jim in Pimlico. Hello, Jim.
Oh, good morning, Nick. I have a brief request for you. I'm requesting you to contact the Foreign Secretary and ask him to ask the Swedish police to come and question Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy or via video link. This would save taxpayers an awful lot of money and free up the police to deal with more important matters.
Today, it's second year since Mr Assange sought sanctuary at the embassy. The policing bill, Deputy Prime Minister, is at £6.5 million.
Yeah, look, I understand people's frustration about this sort of mounting bill that's landing on our lap when Julian Assange, if I understand it correctly, for perfectly obvious reasons, should be facing justice in his own home country.
He's frightened he'll be abducted or somehow swept off to the US.
Well, look, Sweden is not a banana republic. I mean, Sweden, as far as I can make out, is a pretty civilised country with a pretty sophisticated justice system, and I'm assuming they will give him a fair trial in line with Swedish law.
What about the idea of a video link or something like that?
I have no idea whether that, Jim. I have no idea whether that would work. I'm not a Swedish prosecutor, but I do accept that the best thing would be for Julian Assange to basically put himself into the hands of the Swedish judicial system, not into the hands, if you like, of the British police, and footed by the bill of which is footed by the British taxpayers.
We end on a lighter note. There's been some heavy subjects. I don't know what the Spanish for anger or bad temper is, but
in your house, pictures on the television of the new king.
Indeed. Well, however we say congratulations, we say that, of course, in Spanish. How was the Clegg?
Felicidades.
Felicidades. Okay,
say that again, Nick.
Felicidades. How's that?
Very good. Very good.
How was the Clegg household last night with the Spanish?
Bit glum.
Dear, oh
Bit
dear.
glum. But as my 10-year-old, it just shows the great maturity of my children. He was rather sort of quiet last night. But then this morning he said, he said very philosophically, I suppose that's what makes World Cup so interesting. And I thought, isn't he wise?
He's a politician.
Well ahead of his years.
And just looking ahead to tonight, you got the score right last week. You may recall when I asked you.
I predict a 2-1 victory for England. How about that? Slightly the wrong way around there.
Yeah, so you got the score right.
Slightly the wrong way around.
So can we now get Mystic Clegg on what we will see tonight? Mystic Clegg, that's quite clever.
OK, 1-0 to England.
1-0.
I think it's going to be really tightly fought, but I think we're going to...
Okay.
We're going to pit
and the
them
whole
at the
house now switches to England, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, full square.
As if there was any doubt.
Nick Clegg, thank you for being here. Well, Cool Clegg on LBC when news is next.
Good morning, I'm Lisa Aziz. The Deputy Prime Minister has told LBC the government is doing everything it can to discourage British people going to